Okay. Last but not least, we have a terrific panel gathered here to discuss Jerusalem as key to Palestinian-Israeli peace. And as we know, peace negotiations between the Palestinians and Israel are at a standstill. A lot is going on behind the scenes, and even outrightly, such as recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, the moving of the Israeli embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the stopping the funding to UNRWA, the closing down of the mission of the Palestinian Liberation Organization in Washington, D.C., and in my humble opinion, the deal of the century is being implemented without even announcing it in the first place. But we will see what's going to happen. So the questions are we at a dead end? How can peace be advanced? So this panel will present what it takes to reignite the peace flame. And I'm honored to be joined here by Mr. Khalil Jahshan, who is the Executive Director of Arab Center, Washington, D.C., Dr. James Zoghbi, who is President of the Arab American Institute, and Her Excellency Fida Abdelhadi Nasser, who is Ambassador, Deputy Permanent Observer of the State of Palestine to the United Nations. Each of the panelists will have 15 minutes. And once we go through the round, then we will open it to Q&A, and we will address as many questions as we can. We will conclude around 10 minutes to 5, give or take. Then we have a statement to read, which is a very short one-page statement to conclude the conference and move us forward into action. Thank you very much. So now I call upon, as is arranged in the program, Mr. Khalil Jahshan to give us his presentation for 15 minutes.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. And it's a pleasure to be here. And as a regular participant in HCEF annual conferences, it's good to see some of the old-timers here. I recognize some of the faces from last time. The title of our panel is Jerusalem Key to Palestinian-Israeli Peace. Let me say that, you know, in a way, probably when the organizers decided on that title, maybe the situation was slightly different. I do agree with the implication of the title that Jerusalem is key to Palestinian-Israeli peace. As a matter of fact, it's very central, and it reminds me of a video we did about 25 years ago in AAA in a previous incarnation called Jerusalem, a deal maker or a deal breaker. At the time, there was a very heated debate here in Washington about what to do with Jerusalem, and it's actually a sentence that I borrowed from Jim Baker at the time, who came up with that statement. However, as we all know, a lot of water have traveled under the bridge in recent months, particularly since the beginning of this year and particularly since the beginning of this administration. So I'm not sure whether we need to totally kind of dedicate. We will bring up the issue of Jerusalem. I know I will. But I'm not sure that the presentation or my presentation should be totally focused on, frankly, the centrality of Jerusalem, because it seems to me like at this time there is no even Palestine in the equation. So I don't know what the usefulness is of talking about Jerusalem as being central to a peace process when there is no peace process. There is nothing going on at this time on purpose. So peace talks between the Palestinians and the Israelis, as all of you know, are at a standstill. As a matter of fact, the whole, not just peace negotiations, but the whole situation in Palestine is right now at a standstill. Gaza, of course, remains under siege, a separate kind of entity in and of itself with its own basket of issues, which reminds me of the statement or the adage, that Faiz Abu Rahmi, an organizer and at one point Attorney General in Gaza, used to say when he came to visit us here in Washington, he always began his presentations, particularly to Congress, by saying, "Welcome to the planet Gaza." And it is a planet, frankly, and it has, in and of itself, as if it's totally detached from mankind, and it's surrealistic to continue to see these developments going on and on. But Gaza remains under siege. The Great March of Return, as it is dubbed, is continuing. Since March, more than 210 people have died, mostly young people, most of them shot to death by Israeli snipers. About 18,000 people have been injured and maimed. To be exact, 17,259 as of this week. At the same time, I think to put things in context, let me say that the Palestine problem, as far as I'm concerned, as a person of Palestinian origin, who actually has his whole life kind of began with this Palestine problem. I was, 5 days old in 1948 when Israel was declared as an independent state. And I lived through high school there and witnessed some of these events, and then came to the States in the late 60s. But when, as a student of the Middle East, as a student of the Palestine problem, as a student of the Arab-Israeli issue for the past 50 years, I can tell you that with a clear conscience, that this phase right now that we are witnessing today is probably the most critical, the worst juncture in Arab-Israeli affairs, and particularly in Palestinian affairs. We are all familiar with the economic difficulties. You have discussed some of that today. The political difficulties that have been faced by Palestinians throughout the years, internal and external wars, almost civil wars. They were not civil, but they call them civil wars, between Palestinian groups over the years, external wars between different host countries and the Palestinians. Yet, when you look at all these phases before, between 1948 and I would say this time, some hope did exist in the past. Maybe misplaced hope, maybe exaggerated hope, but there was always an element of hope in the sense that Palestinians, at least, and I'm trying to kind of reflect today their sentiment the best I could, they had some hope that there is some kind of a solution down the road somewhere, somehow. And yet today, you're not going to find very many Palestinians in Palestine that adhere to that today. It's in addition to the fact that it's being the worst period in the history of this conflict, it's the total, almost total absence of hope that is so depressing and worrisome. Today, if I were to call this, I mean, I have different, over the years in my presentations, I keep calling these stages in Palestinian history different funny names so that students, when I used to teach, and people in the audience can retain what I'm trying to say. So the first period, 1948 to the 60s, I used to call the ET phase of the Palestine conflict, the I want to go home phase, okay? So people can, remembered that for a while. This one, I would say, is the liquidation stage of the Palestinian conflict. You know this term, liquidation? Those of you who are of Palestinian origin probably grew up knowing that, and other people who are well versed into the dictionary of Arab-Israeli conflict are familiar with the term, but Palestinian leaders have milked this term to death. I remember it as a kid, didn't know what it was, but we all kept repeating it as little kids because we heard politicians all the time, liquidation, liquidation, تصفية القضية الفلسطينية, the liquidation of the Palestinian cause. They used it, of course, for different reasons. They used it as the opiate of the masses, if you will, to control, to govern, to influence people, and mostly, as of course we're familiar in this town with this tactic called scare tactic. These people that are about to invade our country from the south, the liquidation of the Palestine cause was used. So some people invented fake news and scare tactics long time before this Trump guy showed up on the scene. In my analysis, I would say there are four major contributing factors. There are more, but four major ones for the purpose of our discussion and limited time frame that I would like to dwell on. First, I would say let's start with cleaning house first. The Palestinian crisis of leadership right now is the main factor internally. By that, I mean that today there is no public trust in the current Palestinian leadership, like it or not. Mr. Abbas is a good friend. I've known him for years. I've dealt with him long before he became a politician, and dealt with him for more than 30 years. He has done some things right, some things wrong, but the fact of the matter today, as we speak, 60% of the public in Palestine think that he should resign. This is the last public opinion survey conducted in Palestine. The leadership in general, not just personal Abbas, but the leadership in general seems to be lacking in a political strategy. It doesn't seem to have a sense of direction. There is no national unity. These two parties are kind of locked in a hug of death, Fatah and Hamas, to the detriment of the Palestinian national interest. I could care less who's right and who's wrong as a person of Palestinian origin that lives in the diaspora, if you will, who immigrated to this country, but it bothers me that they don't seem to be putting the national interest of Palestinians and the future of Palestine ahead of their public differences in terms of who wants to rule. And clearly, one is incapable of governing and the other one is incapable of playing a loyal democratic opposition. There is no political initiative right now in Palestine. You look at this detriment, at this cul-de-sac that we find ourselves in as Palestinians, the leadership is not presenting a way out of this predicament. Two, on the Arab side, let's kind of move a little bit to the macro. The Arab collective abdication today from the Arab-Israeli conflict is a major factor affecting the situation. This quick resignation, one after the other. Who do you blame? Frankly, again, I will start with the Palestinians. If it weren't for that period in the Palestinian struggle, where we kept talking about the Palestinian independent decision-making, most people took it innocently as something good that Palestinians should have. That pushed the Arabs out of the equation. That began way back in the 70s and 80s. But now the Palestinians are paying the heavy price. It is not at the mass level, but it is at the government level. Why do I say that? The last public opinion survey we have conducted at the Arab Center, we do annual surveys called Arab Index, Arab Opinion Index. We actually interview, our database is about 18,000 people. This year we did it in 11 countries, including, by the way, Saudi Arabia. And in that survey, 80% of the respondents, 18,000 of them, said that the Palestine question is not the property of the Palestinians. It is an Arab issue. It's my issue. They picked that as their answer. 85%, 5 more, in all these 11 countries, the average, the highest, was actually in Tunisia. The second highest was in Saudi Arabia. 85% on average said that no to normalization. No to normalization. Yet we have these countries, rulers, stepping on their own public opinion, not taking into consideration their own public opinions, carrying to meet and even with the worst of the worst, Netanyahu and others. I mean, I could see some Israelis that an Arab would like to meet with, but there is a limit, as they say in Hebrew, yesh gvul. There is a limit to insanity. And I don't understand what's happening with this. But Palestine today is no longer on the common agenda of the Arabs. The name Palestine, unfortunately, is becoming a dirty word in some sectors of the Arab countries. I tweeted just 48 hours ago, a tweet, making a suggestion, not necessarily attacking somebody or criticizing anybody, making a suggestion that this crazy meeting that just took place between the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and this group described as evangelical Christian leaders from the United States, who are neither evangelical nor Christian as far as I'm concerned, nor leaders for that matter. And I criticized the meeting as somebody should have cleared that group. Somebody should have vetted that group. It's embarrassing. And you should see the attacks. Somebody unleashed about 700 with the same message. People attacking me for being a dirty Palestinian. I should go fight for my people. I have sold my national rights to Palestine to be an American, and on and on and on. Same messages again and again and again. Somebody is directing that from above, but that's basically the current state of Arab affairs as far as Palestine is concerned right now. The third one is the lack of Israeli leadership at this time. Not that leadership in Israel have been forthcoming all along. I mean, I've lived there during periods where there were leaders that were viewed positively in this country, but they were not necessarily viewed equally positively by the Palestinians. But there was some give and take for a while. Now there is no give and there is no take. There is a leadership in Israel that's morally and politically bankrupt, that doesn't believe in any form of arrangement with the Palestinian people at all, zero. And they hide behind statements like, we have no partners on the other side. Well, you create partners on the other, especially when you are the strong party to a conflict. You accommodate, you make, by meeting people halfway, you create leadership on the other side. Second is the radicalization of Israeli society. Israeli society is not what it used to be last year. It is not what it used to be 10 years ago. It's not what it used to be certainly 40 years ago when I left there. It was totally different. Today, there are very few believers in a negotiated, peaceful political settlement between the two parties in Israel. The political bankruptcy of the opposition has been very, very clear, very significant. I don't want to offend my friend Jim by saying it reminds me of some of the moral bankruptcy on the part of our Democratic friends in this town to see how labor disintegrated, but Jim would agree that there is some bankruptcy there that he has been advocating all along and criticizing. Moral. The other one is the U.S.-Palestinian relationship. With all due respect to the current administration, I think this administration has essentially declared war on the Palestinian people. It started with maybe the PA, went to the PLO, went to Hamas. There are different aspects, but frankly, today, the Palestinian people have become the target, the enemy. Just like the media are the enemy of the people, for this president in the Middle East, the Palestinian people are the enemy of the people as far as this administration is concerned. The policy seems to be managed by inexperienced and unqualified team. I say that because there are some former diplomats in the audience who know what I'm talking about. This team is clearly opposed to the concept of two states. It's clearly opposed to independent Palestinian statehood. It's clearly opposed to any compromise on Jerusalem. It's clearly opposed to any compromise on settlements. And basically, it's opposed to the conventional wisdom that emerged from many, many years of attempts at peacemaking in the Middle East. These attempts, we all know, failed for all kinds of objective and subjective reasons. But frankly, their only success, little tiny success, was the fact that they created a conventional wisdom, some sort of parameters that everybody who's an expert on the region knows if you want to have peace, you need to do 1, 2, 3. This crowd doesn't believe in the 1, 2, 3 that need to be followed if we are to resolve this conflict. The ultimate deal they promised us is nowhere to be seen. We don't even know yet. They've been talking about it for 2 years. There is no deal and there is no ultimate. There is just nonsense. And it hasn't materialized. Their actions speak louder than their words. What they did on Jerusalem, what they did on UNRWA, what they did on the right of return, what they did on the refugees, what they did on the closure of the PLO office, what they did on cutting U.S. Economic aid to the Palestinians, what they did on cutting U.S. humanitarian aid for hospitals, damn it, is unforgivable and intolerable. So, and to add insult to injury, they just also took the consulate that historically has stood for as a gesture to the Palestinian people in Jerusalem and put it under Mr. Friedman's control at the newly established U.S. embassy in Jerusalem. Meanwhile, the Palestinians unfortunately continue to play defense. Nothing urgently right now or seriously kind of visible in terms of their strategy. And what they are doing is also not just in Israel and in the US and in the Arab world, but the Palestinian leadership is also guilty of ignoring Palestinian public opinion, which I'd love to discuss a little bit more during the Q&A. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate it.
Thank you. You covered the field. And and some of the points I was going to make were there. I wouldn't disagree with anything you said, and I don't want to repeat what you've said. So I think I would try to focus on a couple of issues that you hadn't spoken of. The first is this issue of what appears to be creeping normalization. A minister here, a Netanyahu there, etc.
Volleyball team.
The
Could you define that? I didn't really know that. What do you mean by normalization?
effort to turn the Arab Peace Initiative upside down, to recognize Israel and make it a normal country in the region before it does any of the things that were required of it to do so. Just a couple observations about that. The one is this administration is putting enormous pressure on people to do it. One of the lures is that it will be helpful to help defeat Iran or to isolate Iran. And the second is that if Israel feels more secure, this is an argument that goes back to the very beginning. If Israel feels more secure, they'll be more accommodating to make compromises. With regard to the first, we've actually polled on that, Khalil, in a very direct way. We've said the question, we've said people have suggested, policymakers have suggested that the Arab states should join with Iran to confront, join with the Arab states to confront Iran and extremist Islamic movements. And we gave three options. One was it's a good idea if Israel agrees to fulfill the terms of the Arab Peace Initiative. The second was that even if Israel does fulfill the terms of the Arab Peace Initiative, we shouldn't do it. And the third was we shouldn't do it whether they do or they don't agree. About 1 or 2% thought it was a good idea, period, depending on the country. And so there is simply no tolerance for it. And while people here get confused by, I mean, policymakers in Washington never learn to distinguish between sycophancy and reality. So, you know, if you're the subordinate, as most Arab leaders feel they're the subordinate, they'll say anything to the master, who they perceive to be the master, to get their way or to court them. American policymakers never learn to distinguish between the two. So, oh yes, they're really very willing to do this. They really want to do this. Nonsense. The best gift you could give to Iran right now and any extremist group would be to have an overt relationship with Israel. And so that simply isn't going to happen. And secondly, with regard to the normalization, bringing us closer to peace, making Israel more accommodating, that's also nonsense. I mean, Israel has a practice of demanding concessions on the basis that it'll make us more willing to compromise, pocketing the concession and then going on their merry way and then asking for yet more concessions. Just two experiences I had directly. One was before Madrid. There was this push, as you recall, to have Arabs end the secondary boycott and the exchange that Baker promised that they would do a freeze on settlements. He'll get Israel to do that. And that deal was done. The secondary boycott ended and the freeze was announced. I went leading a delegation of Builders for Peace, this group that Vice President Gore started right after Oslo. We took a delegation there in early '94, and as we were driving past Tel Aviv, a couple of the Jewish businessmen who hadn't been there in a few years were marveling at the lights on the buildings. There was Sanyo and Samsung, and they said, my God, none of these things were here. The peace process is really paying off. Sure, it was, because the secondary boycott ended and these companies that hadn't done business were now there. The next day we were driving north from Jerusalem toward Ramallah, and we were passing construction site after construction site on hill after hill after hill. They said there was no settlement expansion. One of the Jewish guys on the trip said, oh, but the Israelis have assured us this isn't expansion, this is just natural growth. Natural growth on the next damn hill, natural growth, right? So the boycott ended, the secondary boycott ended, but the settlements never ended. I went to the Casablanca summit, which was again one of the sweeteners to make peace possible in late '94. And when we got there, the Israelis were like kids at a carnival. I mean, it was like they were obviously so thrilled to be in an Arab country, and anybody dressed in a thawb, this was pre-selfie, but it was like they'd line up and another one to take a picture. I mean, they were sending home pictures. Here we are with the Arabs, and it's great. And I chaired a session on the Palestinian economy, and it was a great discussion. It went wonderfully in terms of the issues that were discussed with the various Palestinian ministers. The follow-up to that was the next year in Amman, and I was to chair a session there, but it didn't work. Because while Israeli leaders were there and government people from the Palestinian Authority were there and Americans were there and the business community from Israel and business leaders from around the Arab world were there were no Palestinian businessmen. Because Israel closed the border and would not allow the Palestinians to cross. They wouldn't give them permits to cross. It was as if the Palestinians had opened the door to the Arab world by signing Oslo, and the Israelis went through and closed the door after them. I got mad and pushed back that we had to have some meetings with Palestinian business leaders, so we moved the meeting to Jerusalem. We were at the consulate. We had with us Yossi Beilin and a few of the other Israelis were there. We had folks from the embassy, and we had American business leaders, and we had Israeli business leaders. There were no Palestinians. The guy sitting next to me from the consulate passed me a note. He said, damn, Arafat probably won't let him in. He won't let them come. Literally within 5 minutes after he gave me that note, we got a phone call from one of the Palestinians, the head of the chamber in Ramallah, saying, we are at the checkpoint and we can't get in. The Israelis won't let us through. Again, an example that the sweeteners are pocketed, and then they move on to the next one. They simply don't work. So if, number one, anyone thinks that an Arab alliance with Israel to confront Iran is actually going to happen, not. And two, it actually would give Iran a talking point that they would use quite vigorously. Because we found our same thing in the polling in terms of Arab attitudes. We call it the hole in the heart, the wound in the heart that never healed in the Arab world. And while in different periods of time you can do polling, when Palestine is quiet and Syria is exploding, sure, you'll get Syria is really on my mind more than anything. But when there is trouble in Palestine, every Arab pays attention, and it simply is not ever going to go away as an issue in terms of being central to Arab concerns. Now, given that, and given the reality of where we are now that I think Khalil describes perfectly, we have tough choices that we have to make. And I don't think that they're actually choices that trouble me so much as they sort of provoke me to want to think new thoughts. We keep hearing, if this happens, it's the end of the peace process. Or, you know, the issue of the two-state solution here in America has become a mantra that politicians use to absolve themselves from doing anything. Oh, no, I support the two-state solution. Meanwhile, there is no two-state solution, and everything you're doing is making that possibility less likely. For years, I had to confront this issue of two states or one state, and I would say, it is not up to me to subject or to impose my feeling on people and say, you have to suffer for another century because I'm going to say one state as opposed to two states. The easiest, the shortest, the quickest way to provide rights was separate people and be done with it. I've come to the conclusion that that is never going to happen. That if you look at the realities on the ground, they are very clear. If with a lot of show and hoopla, Israel had to expend enormous energy to get 5,000 punks out of Gaza, and remember, the settlers themselves had left, and these were the kids who were kind of acting out. The number of those acting out in the West Bank are even greater. Take a look at daily reports of settler violence and settler harassment of Palestinians. And think about what it would take to move. I mean, people say, well, you have to move only about 80 to 200,000 of those 600,000 that are there. You have to figure out which Israel. See, from the very beginning, the Israelis insisted Palestinians have a civil war to deal with their extreme. Israel never wanted to confront its own extremes and have its own civil war. And there's no way to find an Israeli government willing to do it now. Nor is there a chance, even every time I look at polls and look at the situation in Israel, there's no way you get to 61 in terms of a Knesset membership that is going to be accommodating toward peace. And even if you got to 61, there's no way you get to 61 without an Arab bloc. And as Rabin found, with an Arab bloc, with the Arab members of the Knesset being as part of your majority, there's no way you have the authority over the 59 that will allow you to take the steps necessary to evacuate settlements or to move the wall or to do the things, to make the tough choices that we have to make. Tough choices only because you got yourself into that hole in the first place. The reality is that we have a one state. There is one state right now. It is an apartheid state. There is no human rights, no equality, no justice for the majority of the population who live between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Period. Period. Whatever you call it, it is a fact that there is no two-state possible. I don't see it coming. If you look at the maps, I remember one time I was in the office with Aaron David Miller during this period when I was working on Builders, and they just finished creating the new maps. And there were all these little circles. And he said, all that's got to happen now is these circles all got to get connected. And then there's a state. And I said, Aaron, what if it is by design that they're little circles and they'll never get connected? Oh, no. I did my dissertation on the Arab population in Israel from 48 to 67. The strategy was very clear. You took the land, because Arabs in Palestine, unlike other parts of the Mediterranean, instead of having individual ownership, they have collective ownership. People lived in a village and owned the land around the village and farmed it collectively. So the Israeli strategy was you pocket them in the village and you take the land around the village. Strangling growth, they created was a concept that was novel in Israeli anthropology. It was you created landless peasants. They had the value system of peasants but without land, and therefore they became landlocked and became dependent on day labor jobs in Israel because they could no longer do the farming that they'd done. When you look at Area C, and you look at the roads that have been built, the design was twofold. One was to make sure, as the Drobel's plan said in the 1970s, that there would never be a possibility of a contiguous Palestinian state. That was by design. The second is, by taking the land and denying the natural growth of the indigenous people to ensure the natural growth of the settler population, you made sure that there would not only be no contiguity, but there would also be an impoverished Palestinian people. When we were doing Builders for Peace, working with the World Bank, the idea was how to create an indigenous economy. We concluded a couple of things. One was that you could not build an indigenous economy unless you could import and export the absence of raw materials. The second is you couldn't do it unless you could build economies of scale within. But if you're having a factory in Hebron and you can't market easily in Ramallah or go to Nablus, then you can't even do, you have little small competing factories in each town without being able to build, create even a domestic market, no less an external market. That being the case, we have to confront the reality. And that, I think, opens some exciting possibilities for conversation. And I mean it without depression. I think that there's the need here to say, it's one state, it's an apartheid state. What is our strategy moving forward to secure justice, equality, and human rights? It opens new possibilities of struggle, new possibilities of even identifying problems, and new ideas of how we think together to move this situation forward. BDS, obviously, is one tool, an important tool. It means we have to fight like hell against Congress. It means we have to fight like hell against state legislatures. It means we have to do what the ACLU is doing with several other groups around the country and fighting the legality of that. We also have to encourage more and more churches and businesses to take those measures themselves. But we also have to have a strategy within Palestine and support those in Palestine who are arguing for and making the case for the principle of human rights, equality, and justice being paramount instead of negotiations for peace. I think that given what the Palestinian Authority has done to date, and the most significant thing is I was with Riyadh last night. Palestine is the chair of the group of 77.
Yeah.
That's huge. That's huge. Should never be overlooked. It's almost as if the Palestinians can see themselves back where they were at the time of the Bandung Conference, as a leadership, playing a leadership role in but they have to change the argument of what they're calling for from two states and negotiations, separation and negotiations, to what Mandela did, which is argue for equality, justice, and human rights. A transformation of the very struggle to a whole new level. And I will stop there.
Thank you very much. Let's hear now from Her Excellency Fida Abdelhadi Nasser.
Thank you, and I am most honored to join such distinguished presenters, Dr. Jahshan and Dr. Zoghbi. No, from when I began long ago in the early 90s, they were legends, and they have persevered through today. So it is an honor for me as we gather to consider the many challenges that are facing the just cause of Palestine at this moment, and it is an existential moment, as Dr. Jahshan pointed out, in any way that we examine the issue. The question that was posed to our panel was, how can we reignite the peace flame? So I always go well prepared, so bear with me, because this is what I would try to address. But there are a lot of convergences. And so against this backdrop of an ever-deteriorating political, humanitarian, socioeconomic, and security situation, and a deepening human rights and protection crisis in occupied Palestine, it's obviously very difficult to feel optimistic or to even imagine what could possibly reignite the peace flame. And perhaps this diminishing belief that a just peace is within our reach is one of the biggest obstacles that we face today. How can peace be made if people no longer believe in its promise, and if there is no credible horizon to achieve it? If it's only proven over and over that justice is unattainable, that impunity reigns, then the cynicism and despair that we see all around us are only going to become more formidable obstacles on the path to peace. So restoring hope and conviction among the Palestinian people and those who support them in the possibility of justice and peace, I believe, must therefore be among our main priorities. So this requires several urgent steps. And of course, without dwelling too much on it, it requires an immediate effort to alleviate the dire situation on the ground, bolstering the resilience of the Palestinian people. And this was addressed as to the importance of the people, not just the sites, the living stones in Palestine. After half a century of Israeli occupation and 70 years of an ongoing Nakba, the hopes of our people have not just been depleted, but their coping capacities. The coping capacities that have been at the core of their legendary steadfastness. And this is reflected in the distress that we witness in Jerusalem, in Gaza, in Bethlehem, in Al-Khalil, all across occupied Palestine, and in our refugee communities across the region. And so I do believe that enhanced humanitarian action is vital to meet human needs, but it's also essential for restoring hopes that a better future, a free future, is possible. At the same time, and I think this is where we will converge, I think that we need to act to reinforce rights as the foundation of our cause and the source of its justice and strength. Among ourselves and in our outreach to others, we need to foster deeper understanding of our rights in accordance with international law. So just as we would wish for our youth to know their heritage, for example, we must ensure that they know their rights. This is critical for shifting the conversation and focus in this country in particular to a more rights, law-based approach to Palestine towards rectifying biased and harmful policies and ultimately advancing our struggle for freedom. Regrettably, the facts and legitimacy of our rights have been lost here in the US, as Israel and its lobby have managed to create so much toxicity around our issue. If you just look at any presidential debate or congressional legislation on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, we spend an inordinate amount of time pushing back against the propaganda that the issue is about terrorism or that this is a religious conflict. There's little space for religion as a force for social good to shape moral and humane decision-making, and instead it's being exploited by extremists, Israeli extremists, but also their Christian evangelical Zionist supporters, used as a pretext to justify Israel's violations, its claims of insecurity, anti-Semitism, where it's persuaded policymakers that it is under a constant security threat of Palestinians, casting the very same people it occupies and oppresses as terrorists, with even children and peaceful protesters dehumanized. So of course, I mean, yes, religion is a factor in the conflict. Yes, there is violence and terror are symptoms of the conflict, not its cause. But we cannot accept that we allow unchallenged the premise that Palestinian rights that support for Palestinian rights be equated with anti-Semitism, or accept that political, legal, or nonviolent popular resistance to the occupation and criticism of Israel's crimes be equated with terror. The facts have to be established. This is about a people seeking their freedom in their homeland. This is a political, territorial, human rights issues. These are the key messages that we have to amplify. I always find it stunning that in a country where Patrick Henry and his declaration, "Give me liberty or give me death," made him an American patriot, it's so difficult to understand and support the Palestinian call and struggle for freedom. It's just difficult to understand that disconnect. But obviously the distortions of our cause by Israeli propaganda, by the power of the Israeli lobby, have turned this into a hot button issue in the US rather than the peace and justice and equality issue that it is, as it is viewed almost everywhere else in the world. And we've seen this fueling unjust American policies, which just in this past year, as Dr. Jahshan referred to, included the Trump Declaration on Jerusalem, the embassy transfer, the termination of UNRWA funding, attempts to undermine Palestine refugee status and rights, the closure of the PLO office in DC, in addition to the hostility and humiliation routinely meted out against us under the guise of legislation in Congress, under AIPAC spells such as the Taylor Force Act or any other such legislation. So all of this has to be more firmly confronted, and I believe that doing so based on rights could provide most potential for change. I see legislation being promoted by Representative Betty McCollum, for example, on the rights of Palestinian children as an important model of such an approach that must be built upon. So in terms of, let's say, educating our own and others on our rights, for example, we have to establish as fact in the mainstream discourse that the Palestinian people have a right to self-determination and freedom. And this is non-negotiable in any context, even if it is said that negotiations are what will bring us to a solution. That is not negotiable. This people has to be free. The ICJ determined this in specific in its advisory opinion in 2004 for the Palestinian people to be a right. The self-determination is a right erga omnes, meaning owed to all people. There's not one people that can be excluded from this right. It also has to be established as fact that the right to return is not a claim. It's not a claim. It is an individual and collective right according to international law and to which all refugees are entitled. And for Palestine refugees, this right, affirmed in Resolution 194 in 1948, has been reaffirmed or recalled in more than 150 resolutions, practically constituting customary international law. And so this cannot simply be negated to fulfill Israel's wish of a Jewish majority and must be seriously and humanely addressed in the context of any just solution. And the list goes on, including the prohibition on the acquisition of territory by force, which is universal. The Palestinian people have a right to their land and cannot be the exception. So framing our messaging clearly and consistently based on these rights and indisputable facts could help raise awareness, change perceptions, and open hearts and minds. And I would say that this rights and law-based approach has been central to our work at the United Nations on behalf of the Palestinian people. How else could a little Palestinian delegation effectively engage on the international stage to confront this illegal Israeli occupation, even as it is being fully backed by the world's superpower? Things are not looking up, this is true, but we are holding our own on the basis of international law and rights, which we will not forsake. So this approach was critical for us in addressing the situation of Jerusalem following President Trump's decision last December. And our efforts in that regard will be my main illustration of focusing on rights and the law. Despite all of our anger and dismay at the announcement, we did not retreat. We immediately mobilized, guided by the law. On the very same day of the announcement, just a few hours later, in official communications to the UN Security Council, the General Assembly, and Secretary General, we asserted our rights and reminded states of relevant resolutions and legal obligations and demanded international action to counter this unlawful decision. That letter, along with several other pieces of information, is in a packet that I've asked the conference to share as part of my presentation to illustrate this. Our appeal underscored the Security Council's long-standing determination of the illegality of, quote, all measures to change the demography, character, and status of Jerusalem. And this includes Israel's imposition of the Basic Law and attempts to annex the city, which the Council declared as flagrant violations of the Fourth Geneva Convention and having no legal validity. In Security Council Resolution 478 in 1980, the Council further directly called on those states that have established diplomatic missions at Jerusalem to withdraw such missions from the Holy City. And this was key. Yes, it is a resolution from 1980, but it remains valid. This was key to the position that we were able to carve out and maintain at the UN, but one that is being respected by the overwhelming majority of the international community, whereby actions by Israel and the US to the contrary cannot negate these resolutions or the law's applicability, and the majority of countries around the world, except for a few firebrands, like we see now with Brazil, the president-elect promising he's going to move his embassy, flirting with the idea of moving the embassy to Jerusalem or recognizing it as Israel's capital. But on the whole, other than Guatemala, one state out of 193 states in the world, one state mimicked the US, because we have been able to assert our position, not defensively, proactively, and say, when you violate that, you are in the wrong. You are unethical, you are immoral, and what you are doing is illegitimate. So aside from making that appeal, we also presented an official statement to the Security Council, stressing our rights, that the status of East Jerusalem is occupied, the illegality of all measures, and the illegitimacy of US recognition, and calling for respect of the historic status quo, protecting the Muslim and Christian holy sites. And these same principles and messages were then echoed by council members and capitals across the globe in a constant refrain, rejecting the US decision and calling for it to be rescinded. Immediately thereafter, again, based on rights and the law, we drafted a resolution to reaffirm those principles and UN legislation. And the Palestine delegation at the UN negotiated that resolution for 10 days, even though knowing that we would get a US veto. But the point was to consecrate the international consensus as withstanding the Trump attempts. And we got 14 out of 15 countries on the Security Council to vote in favor of that resolution. 14 countries representing the rest of the international community, with the exception of Israel and the US, which again vetoed the resolution. And we continued through to the General Assembly, et cetera, in asserting that position. Now, and we have an annual resolution, for example, on Jerusalem in the General Assembly, which will be adopted again this December. And a lot of people say, what is the point of all this repetition? These resolutions are not respected. They are safeguarding the rights of our people until the day that justice can be achieved. And so while these resolutions, for example, have not stopped the US from acting on their decision, their significance rests in the unequivocal reaffirmation of the law and international position on this matter, and denies both Israel and the United States the legitimacy and the recognition that they're looking for these illegal actions. So again, rather than being defensive, we need to be assertive and insistent, secure in the knowledge of our rights. The same way they hammer their propaganda and lies, we must hammer our truth and our facts. And this has been key for us at the United Nations in defending and upholding Palestinian rights. And for us, this legislation forms a first line of defense. Were it not for these resolutions, again, I would ask of you to consider what the situation and status of Jerusalem might be today at the hands of Israel. I mean, while undeniably bad, it would be far worse. So I believe that we don't have to keep framing and reframing our arguments in ad hoc ways to respond to each challenge. We don't need to keep reinventing the wheel. So whether you support two states or one state, a binational state, a confederation of states, the central pillar of our cause remains that we have inalienable rights and that the law, justice, is on our side. So I think that this too has often been lost in the anger and despair, typically characterizing our narratives and in the heated rhetorical debates on this issue. We have to refocus and unite, relying more consistently on the law and informed assistance on our rights and universal principles in our messaging and advocacy. And I think this is key in terms of our own outreach to others, but also in terms of educating our youth if we seek for them to carry forth this struggle for freedom. And that the law has not yet resulted in accountability doesn't mean that it ultimately won't. Time is not on our side, this is true, but the arc of justice is also very long, as Dr. Zoghbi pointed out. And so those who truly believe in the rule of law believe we will get there one day. And that thus our continuing conviction in the law and in the role, our role at the UN on behalf of the Palestinian people. But, and this is my last point, I would have to ask, what good is it if only we, a small circle of diplomats, academics, legalists, and activists know of these resolutions and of these rights? If it is not more broadly understood and utilized, their value is diminished. And so we have to work to inform and to amplify and mainstream those rights. And as diplomats, we can't be the implementers. So that role has to be pursued by others. The Palestinian leadership, civil society, including faith-based organizations, and popular activism must be coordinated and purposeful for real change to happen. And together we have to assert our rights, push back against the dehumanization of Palestinians by sharing the facts and stories of our people's suffering and dignity and their courage. And I think that the discussion that we had earlier about tourism and building those bridges and opening hearts and minds will be extremely important towards fostering understanding, support, and solidarity among world citizenry, including here in the US, that must then compel their governments to act on principle towards the Palestinian people and their rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have 15 minutes for Q&A. If you can make your questions succinct, your comments succinct, so we can have as many of them as we can. And let's start, please. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I agree fully with Dr. Zoghbi that we need an entirely new approach. Forget about establishing two states, work for civil, political, human rights for the Palestinians. And what that requires is a new type of leadership for the Palestinians, which adopts this as an objective and fights for it. And we need support from the outside for the Palestinians to achieve these rights, which are acknowledged universally, but somehow the Palestinians don't have them. So do you have any idea how to proceed?
Thank you.
Thank you.
With all due respect to the leadership in Ramallah, 47 years ago, I was doing my doctoral dissertation research. It was on what were called revitalization movements, how people under stress, how consciousness is transformed. And I was going to initially do it, because I'd been working with a guy at University of Pennsylvania, Anthony Wallace, with either Native Americans or African American movements in the 20s and 30s. And he said, no. He said, you really ought to deal with Palestinians. It's much more, nobody's working at that, and you really ought to do it. So I go off to Beirut, and I spend a whole bunch of time in the camps collecting people's stories, interviewing them according to the kind of questions that I wanted to elicit from them. And the guy helping me set up the meetings was Ghassan Ganafani. And at one point, I went back to him, telling him what I was finding and what I was doing, and he said, you're in the wrong place. He said that you're looking for how pressure creates new consciousness. He said, in the camps, pressure has frozen old consciousness. People have romanticized the past. People have locked themselves into a value system that was the one that they brought with them. He said, the place where revolutionary consciousness, new thinking is coming, is with the people inside, as he called it. And so off I go to Tawfiq Zayed and Mahmoud Darwish and a whole bunch of other people, and I saw some really fascinating stuff happening. How this translates today to political decision-making in the entirety of Palestine is up to the people there to figure out. but I find some fascinating stuff being done by the Arabs inside, in the Palestinian citizens of Israel. I find I mean, the fact that no sooner had he just been elected to the Knesset than Ayman Oda is off to the Negev to lead a demonstration on behalf of people who their homes were being demolished. And then the next couple of days is up in Barim in the north, doing the same thing, demanding the right to return to their villages. And they had a general strike that actually was embraced by the people in the occupied territories, as well as the Arab community in Israel. I would hope that there'd be a convergence of the political energy coming from the Palestinians inside, the Israeli citizens, and their sophistication in political organizing with the people in the territories, and that to me would make some real sense. That said, I think that the roadmap for us here is laid out. When I started the Palestinian Rights campaign back in the 70s, right? We were doing everything that needs to be done today. We were adopting cases, building coalitions. I mean, I look back sometimes at the stationery we had for the old PHRC, and we had everybody who'd been involved in the peace movement. Everybody, Pete Seeger, Don Luce, Dave Dellinger, Joan Baez. We had people, everybody except Andy Young, who was in Dr. King's circle. They'd all embraced us as part of our advisory board. And we lost that energy. We lost that energy. We need to recapture that. We need to build a movement not on the margins of the left, but with the mainstream of the left. And I think it's possible. Betty McCollum's legislation, I think you're right. It gives us a way forward. And when you focus not on the obscurities of politics, but on the concreteness of cases of human rights, you build broader support. It's tough to identify with where a border is or where a settlement goes or gets, which ones you get rid of. It's much easier to put a face on it and build a movement around it. And that's kind of where I think we need to go. Regardless of whatever outcome you get, the possibility of building a mass human rights movement here for Palestinians, humanizing them, building support for them, and creating a new political center around that issue, I think is very possible.
Great. Again, I encourage that our questions and our responses are a little short so that we can accommodate. Yes, Ambassador Mack.
Yes, I have a question for Ambassador Abdelhadi Nasser, and I would like a comment on it from an American activist point of view from either Jim or Khalil. A lot of us belong to organizations that want to support Palestinians, but are worried about being seen as trying to delegitimize Israel. And it comes down to the question often of BDS and whether we should adopt the kind of BDS that some of the European countries have done, which in effect makes it impossible, would make it impossible for our officials and our members to visit Israel and the occupied territories. What is your view of this? What kind of advice do you have for us?
Thank you, Ambassador Mack, for that question. So I would simply say that there are many tools that one can avail themselves of in civil society or as an activist to support Palestinian rights. And the BDS movement is one tool. It is one mechanism. And it is one that can create a lot of pressure. But it may not be the tool of choice for everyone. And so at the risk of being repetitive, I would say focusing on rights, focusing on the law is central to the kind of work and the kind of support that you want to give. And insisting that your support for the human rights of the Palestinian people, the right of the Palestinian people to be independent, to live in freedom and dignity in their own homeland, that you reject its equation with anti-Semitism or anti-Israeli, and asking your counterparts, is this a zero-sum game? In order to be, pro-Israeli, I have to be anti-Palestinian? What about the human rights of all people and the right of these people to live freely and to coexist? And so again, just to go back to the BDS, it's a tool. It's not for everyone. But those who choose to use it can, and those who choose to raise awareness and to mobilize in a different way can choose different means.
The BDS, in a way, all these types of movements are in the eye of the beholder. The problem we have made is we have allowed Israel and its supporters in this country to redefine the issue kind of to their own liking, mixing on purpose in order to delegitimize, if you will, legitimate support for the Palestinians. So somehow, any BDS type of talk in terms of boycotting, let's say, the product of the settlements. As an American, I should be free enough in this country, even though some are trying to shut me up, to be able to say, I am against something that is anti-American to start with. I am against occupation. I don't want to buy products from an occupation. We have to be a little bit more sensitive in order to minimize that criticism in terms of, are you boycotting Israel because the accusation is any type of boycott of settlements is boycotting Israel. Well, that's their problem, not my problem. I distinguish, and we should be able, the position is defensible on an American basis. And we just have been intimidated, just like the double-edged sword of anti-Semitism. They use the double-edged sword in terms of the BDS movement to intimidate some of us against getting involved in this.
Marwan.
Thank you for the speakers for the presentation. I have a question for everybody. I was in Palestine this past summer, and one of the goals of my visit was to invite Palestinian companies to do trade in the U.S., to invite them to our Al-Quds Festival and to the Palestine Trade Show, which is going to be next weekend, to present their products and services. And the two main complaints were we can't get visas and we cannot ship outside of Palestine, not even to Jordan, because Israel blocks products that in competition with their products from Palestine. So do you see any hope that the US administration can loosen up these rules from Israel and the Palestinians? And my second question to the ambassador, the new elect Brazilian new president is vowing to move the embassy to Jerusalem also. What's up with that, and do you have any strategy to stop it? Thank you.
Can I take the first part? And then we'll go. When I was doing Builders for Peace with Vice President Gore, that was the biggest issue we faced. Our objective was to grow the economy in the West Bank and Gaza. Israel would not allow egress and access and egress to the territories. And so people who were going to set up a factory in Gaza needed to import raw material and export the finished product, et cetera. They couldn't get guarantees of that. And so, as I used to put it, the horses were lined up at the gate and the gate never opened, and so the companies just fell off. I think we blew it back then because we knew what the problem was, and we would continually raise it with the Israelis, but we didn't organize the American business community around it. And I would suggest that your business council raise it with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Raise it with like companies that are doing business there that want to come here, prospective business people here, and raise it not as a political issue, but raise it as a business issue. We want to do business. They're not letting us do business. That's where the human rights effort with PHRC worked. We never got into the politics of it. We built the base of support, and the broader it grew was dependent upon the narrower the issue focused. Palestinians want the ability to do business. They need to import and export. You want to do business. They'd like to do business with you. Israel won't let them. have that be the issue. And I'd be happy to meet with you afterwards and discuss it and see if we can develop a community-wide strategy on that. I think that that would make a lot of sense to a whole lot of people.
And just a little addition to that, I would say your strongest ally on this most probably would be Israeli businessmen. Their lobby is much more liberal on the Palestinian issue because they're motivated totally by profit. They will support that type of stuff, and you have to think of a role also for the Palestinians inside Israel. They're not subject to the same limitations. They can partner with Palestinian businesses in Palestine and work together.
I just quickly want to take it, just a slight issue with that. We found that the worst people to work with the Israeli business community because for them it was 1 or 2% of their market. They weren't willing to give it up. I mean, we had a fight like hell, for example, for Zahi Khoury to get the Coca-Cola franchise because Uzi Wertheimer wasn't going to give it up. And it was a very small piece of his market, but he wasn't going to give it up. It was the same with Burger King. It was the same with a whole lot of folks. I mean, the reason why Israel keeps this as a captive market and the business community support it is because it's a tiny fraction of their market, but they don't want to give it up. And so I would think that I'd focus on the American business community, and I think you're right. Partnerships with the Palestinians inside may be an interesting way around it, but I wouldn't lose sight of the fact that it's an organizing issue that would help bring you to the American business community in a way that might find some support that you didn't think you'd get.
Okay, we have only 2 minutes instead 2 minutes for 3 more questioners. So if the ambassador can respond to the Brazil issue.
Yeah. Just very quickly, it's the same strategy that we've used with regard to the American position, and that is to reaffirm the international position, the rights position, to isolate the Brazilian position. But beyond that, that we will mobilize further in terms of legal consequences. So not just a backlash against states that would violate international law and dismiss it, but actually seeking legal remedies. And at the same time with Brazil, although his position, I'm going to move the embassy, I'm going to vote for Israel in the UN, is deeply worrying, he would have to do this through the Congress in Brasilia. So we are hoping that somehow the sanity will prevail in Brazil, because it is not just about Brazil and Palestine, it is also about their relationship with the rest of Latin America, but the rest of the world. And I think that some states would be hesitant to be seen as non-law abiding states. And so you have to work on that perception and mobilize on that basis.
Okay, please.
I had 2 questions, but maybe you could let me know which one of the 2.
No, just ask and
Okay.
respond to one.
One of them, Mr. Khalil Jahshan.
Yes.
I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it.
No, you did well, better than my mother. Go ahead.
Okay. You mentioned the Palestinian leadership and the public opinion are different, and that you hope to touch on that during the Q&A. I was interested in hearing. My second question was, as you guys shared, if the resilient and steadfast people of Palestine are losing hope and conviction, and you say people from the inside are the ones who can help, how can we help them? What ideas do you have for us? Can we use social media in any way? Maybe you've touched on that already, but those are my 2 questions.
Okay, let's keep the answers short, please.
Why don't you?
The losing hope. In every poll we do of Palestinians in the territories, we're finding that the hope is today, in the most recent one that we finished, 50% said they don't believe peace is even possible. 25% think 2 states, 25% 1 state. It was kind of even, surprisingly, but 50% said they didn't think it was possible, which is up 10 points from last year, when it was about 41% thought that no peace was possible. And so people are basically, especially in the West Bank, Gaza is a different setting because of the priorities and the needs. But in the West Bank, people are saying, I just want to get on with my life. I mean, I think that there's an energy that's been sucked out of them.
Yeah.
Fatigued, exactly. And so leadership has to come from elsewhere. And that's why I think that inside the folks, the Palestinian citizens in Israel, have a kind of an energy and a dynamic. And in East Jerusalem, there's also that same kind of energy and dynamic. Those are two places that are different, I think, than what's going on in several parts of the West Bank, where people have just, you know, they're just trying to figure out, how do I just get by the next week? And that's not a recipe for a mobilized constituency. So I think you're right, we can offer something, but the kind of thing we were talking about with the chamber is one thing I think that can be really helpful to energize folks.
Thank you. I'll be quick.
Yes,
Clearly,
sorry, 1 second, please.
Sure.
Yeah, let me respond very quickly because this is a long, complicated topic, but I'm looking at the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research. Their last survey conducted in Palestine was number 69. You can look at it on their website. Basically, some of the issues, I'll leave it up to you to see where the discrepancy is, but let me tell you what the Palestinian public think. Right now, as we speak, both Fatah and Hamas have lost popular support among the Palestinians. You can see the numbers in the survey. 60%, 63% actually, of the Palestinian people demand the resignation of President Abbas. Basically half, 50% of the Palestinian public view the PA as having become a burden on the Palestinian people. 3/4 view conditions today as worse in the occupied territories, particularly in the West Bank, as those prevailing before the Oslo Accord. So they haven't seen that peace dividend at all compared to the businessmen that went so early in that. In terms of 90% of the Palestinians today view the Trump administration as biased in favor of Israel, so there might be some similarities with the current position of the leadership, although that position can change in 5 minutes should there be a serious, because remember, cutting relations with the US is conditional by the Palestinian government. If Trump retracts his positions on Jerusalem and on refugees and on settlements, we'll go back and talk to him. The people don't want to talk to him. This is the same thing with UNRWA and et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you. Clearly, the U.S. cannot play the role of even-handed mediator in this conflict. There have been references to the important role of civil society and the churches, but what other countries do the panelists think could come up and an individual country or group of countries and assume the role of a mediator that would advance the process towards peace and resolution?
Thank you.
No one's going to step into that role, and I don't think any group of nations will step into that role. But I do think that there are initiatives underway. In particular, I am so excited about what they're doing in Ireland right now, with basically a bill in the Senate to have Ireland lead the way on boycotting Israeli products. It passed once, it needs to pass once more, and then it goes to the House, and hopefully it'll be signed into law. Now, it's one little country, Ireland, but remember, Ireland is the country in Europe that broke with the EU and did the first boycott of South African products that ultimately led the way in the EU. I think Ireland goes first, maybe Belgium second, you'd see Spain fall in line, and you'd begin to see a domino effect in Europe. And I think that would be, now can the EU then replace? See, I think that that's part of the old dynamic, is to see somebody as leading the peace process. There is no peace process. And I don't think there's going to be one, because I don't think there will ever be an Israeli government in the next 20, 30 years that will be in a position where they can make an accommodation for peace. What you have is an internal struggle within the territories, Jordan to the Mediterranean, the struggle for equal rights, justice, and human rights. That's where the struggle is. That's the nature of the struggle. That doesn't need anybody to lead a negotiating process. It's a very different approach. And I sure hope that the ICC acts. It'll make a judgment that will not be honored by Israel, but it continues that effort that the PA has continued to do, which is to increasingly isolate Israel in the world community. And when you lead the Bloc of 77, and you're not even a formal country, but you're recognized by the UN and by the Bloc, that's huge in terms of isolating Israel.
Yeah,
and that's what needs to happen.
sorry, and the G77
Okay.
is actually now one.
No, hold it, sir,
Right.
sir, hold it, please. We don't have time. Yes, please, last.
Right, thank you. All right, first of all, Jim, I agree with you, and I observed for a long time that Palestinian citizens of Israel have a very special and unique role. And also, I have a friend who's doing her dissertation on that at George Mason School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution.
It'll be 10 times better than mine.
All right, well, I'll connect you with her. But I also just wanted to make an announcement that December 10th is the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. December 9th is the 70th anniversary of the Convention on Genocide. And this is very powerful. I've seen many events over the decades of youth, like young kids saying, how come I never knew about this? And adults, people around I've shared this with, and people have used it really as an awakening and as a emboldening. So, perhaps you can do events or, just spread it on the web for December 10th.
Like the right wing here latches on to Article 2 of the Constitution, right, the Second Amendment rather, and they pared down the Bill of Rights to a couple that they like, the rest of them they don't like. The same with the right wing on the Universal Declaration. I mean, they founded institutions on Article 18, the religious freedom one. So when I was sitting as a member of the commission, when I was a commissioner on international religious freedom, and I would bring to them the articles of that declaration that dealt with the right of people to return to their homes, or the right of people not to be discriminated based on their faith or ethnicity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, within that body of law, not law, but of accepted covenant that was passed by most nations in the world, there are so many rights. You're right. People need to know what they are, and they don't know them. They don't know what the Geneva Conventions are. They don't know what the Universal Declaration is. We need to be elevating those, and I think that's what these guys are doing at the UN, and it's really significant.
If I could just say, just on the-
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask the ambassador and Dr.
I've
Zumbi
spoken up.
and so on, and Khalil, 1 minute each, and we're done.
Okay, so just on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it is amplified constantly in our work, as are the Charter rights. After 70 years, these are international norms, and coincidentally enough, this, as November 29th, it has been long declared by the UN, the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. This year, our theme is 70 years of the UN Declaration, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, 70 years of the Palestinian Nakba, to show the disconnect. These are our rights. This is what has happened in Palestine. How do we close that gap? But again, it's about raising awareness. These are universal rights. Why are the Palestinian people deprived of those rights? And speaking on that basis.
Great. Khalil, one last minute.
You get mine, you get two.
Okay. I just want to re-emphasize the point I made in terms of the discrepancy between the ruler and the ruled in the Arab world, and this is not, Palestine is not an exception to that. Last week, just a few days ago actually, the Palestine Central Council met. I know it was probably a symbolic meeting more than a substantive one, but they took some substantive decisions. However, the decisions, as substantive as they were left to the mercy of the president to implement. And I hope that particularly the issue of rejecting the deal of the century, continuing to boycott the administration until it rescinds its decisions, supporting international peace conference with bringing in new countries and new sponsors to that, focusing totally on ending Israeli occupation, and basically suspending recognition of the State of Israel for the first time. I hope that the President of Palestine takes these recommendations seriously and implements them in full. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all very, very much for being on the panel. I promise, I know some of you have to go to certain other locations and meetings and so on. I promise we'll be done in exactly 5 minutes. I would like to thank the organizers, the planning committee, the panelists, the moderators, all participants. This is tremendous. And as promised earlier in the conference, we came together to a consensus, and this is only for your consideration. with a statement about together in faith, Jerusalem, our collective home. So we have with you, we just distributed to you, a statement that in a way embodies what we have discussed during this conference, and the issue of this thinking of rights is very much embedded in this statement. So let me just go very quickly over it. We don't need to take any vote at this point. We just want to put it in your good hands, and then you can send comments to Sir Ratib, and then we take it from there. Jerusalem is a city like no other, nestled deep in the heart of three Abrahamic faith traditions. She carries a special weight in our varied but interrelated beliefs and images of reality. Although these sometimes become entangled with our political goals, it is clear now more than ever that Jerusalem's significance resides in embracing humanity and inclusive relations. Therefore, Jerusalem cannot belong exclusively or even predominantly to one people or one religion. The inhabitants of Jerusalem must have a dignified life and have equal access to housing, jobs, education, medical care, municipal services, political participation, cultural activities, and religious sites. Legal protection is essential. All inhabitants of Jerusalem must be equal before the law. Christians, Muslims, Jews, and others everywhere are urged to advocate for preserving Jerusalem's status quo and for maintaining her as the inclusive center of faith. An answer to the question of Jerusalem must be arrived at through negotiations, not dictation, through fairness, not partiality. Both the process and its outcome must be just and inclusive. Only when Jerusalem is at peace can it fulfill her true universal character and be the center of reconciliation for humanity. We commit ourselves to bringing together religious leaders and peace organizations in support of our collective home, Jerusalem, and to do so in an organized, systematic, and systemic manner. Thank you very much. All the best.
Fantastic presentation. This is from Jewish Voices for